Welcome, everyone, to Scheller Lunchtime Live, a live stream series hosted by the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. My name is Lindsay Kane, and I'm the Associate Director of Client Relationships for non-degree executive education programs. On select Fridays at 12 p.m. Eastern, you'll have the chance to hear from Scheller faculty, student, and alumni speakers as they discuss relevant topics for the tech-driven digital age. At Scheller, we're proud to offer undergraduate, MBA, and PhD programs, along with open enrollment and custom executive education programs. It's my pleasure to introduce Pearl Alexander, Executive Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement at Georgia Tech and Professor of the Practice at the Scheller College of Business. She is a human capital strategist, leadership coach, and transformation expert. Pearl enjoys the distinct privilege of inspiring the work of people and teams responsible for positive culture transformation and management. Pearl has been responsible for various facets of human capital management, including workforce strategies, talent and leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, conflict resolution, and compliance. She is well regarded as a principal relationship builder, a confidant to executives, a champion for people, and a futuristic thought leader. Her notable commentary has been shared in various media, including the Wall Street Journal, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, NPR, and many others. Pearl is regularly invited to moderate sessions at national conferences, sparking conversations on powerful, sensitive, and challenging topics. Her audiences have spanned higher education, government, corporate, and international professionals. She has also served on professional development committees and boards for a number of organizations. She enjoys coaching leaders, storytelling, and using improvisational skills to facilitate connection and spark innovation. Today, Pearl will share insights about how stories shape us and improve our social intelligence, leadership, and relational abilities. She'll discuss storytelling as a transformative change strategy and how telling your own story can help create lasting change. As always, feel free to ask questions in the comments section. Pearl will address as many questions as possible at the end of her presentation. Over to you, Pearl.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and welcome everybody. I am delighted to be here with you today for this wonderful topic of storytelling and inclusive excellence. If I asked you to tell your story to the world, to tell a story to the world, what would you say? Well, back in 2016, we actually started doing that right here at Georgia Tech from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion platform with intention. The intention to engage our workforce, our leaders, especially our people leaders, in learning to be vulnerable, to develop courage. And what better way to develop courage and practice vulnerability than to tell a personal story. So let me just jump in and tell you what I'm going to share today in this brief time that we have together. I'm going to talk about the why for storytelling at Georgia Tech. You've heard the big picture why, the desire for culture transformation. And then there's the other why for us, which is people developing courage. And we believe that those two things work together. So there's the Georgia Tech whistle. Time for the kiddos to change classes. All right, they're on their way. And so as we talk about storytelling, I want you to keep in mind that we started storytelling as a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative at Georgia Tech. We wanted to shift the culture so that we can practice at Georgia Tech being more open to difference so that we can thrive on diversity. And we wanted the leaders to go first in sharing their personal stories, their strengths and their struggles. Oftentimes when people tell stories, they want to tell the good stories, right? And leaders are sometimes totally primed to hear good stories. But when you talk about the struggle in the story, which, by the way, makes it very interesting, sometimes people don't want to hear those stories. So we'll continue to talk about this from both sides. We'll talk about it from the organizational perspective and the personal meaning that is shared when we bear our stories to the world. Storytelling and inclusive excellence is important because it helps people to change. There are two types of ways that we receive and process information. One way is when people give information to us through reports and other types of things like that. But stories compel people to change because we metabolize stories from the inside out. And we believe at Georgia Tech that storytelling is, in fact, an act of inclusion. And our goals around transforming our culture organizationally are to embed equity, inclusion, and belonging as the experience of what it's like to be here, to work, and to study. And in order to do that, that's the organizational piece. We have to work on the personal piece. We have to work on the individuals here. And what we want people to experience is a large and healthy dose of self-acceptance, right? A large and healthy dose of self-awareness. Because if we can be much more aware of how we show up and how we interact with others, we will create cultures where people feel included, they feel seen and heard and valued, and have a sense of belonging. If you've ever told your story publicly or a story publicly, you know the intimate nature of storytelling and the environment that's created when people tell stories. Our brains are wired for storytelling. So when we are in the act of storytelling, we bring people on a journey with us, an adventure. And on this adventure, there's going to be change, evolution, enlightenment, and sometimes this is referred to as the hero's journey, right? Storytelling is an old and ancient art, but we want it to be innovative in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So we brought it in as an initiative that we are continuing to implement to this day. But when you tell your story, you open yourself up. You open up the good, the bad, the ugly. You let the world in. And believe it or not, what that does is create connection. Because we, as story listeners, began to listen for what parts of the story resonate with us. And when we hear stories, we actually activate and light up more parts of our brain than we would if we were just getting factual information. So storytelling is a very important way that we are engaging people in learning about the diversity that we have here at Georgia Tech. Now, we can't talk about telling without talking about listening. Listening is the vessel that holds the stories that are produced. And so as we encourage people to tell their stories, we invite people to listen deeply and to listen outside of judgment, outside of distraction, but deeply listening, because the listening informs the telling. When we receive that type of attention as we tell our stories, we actually can relax and tell them better. And we tell our stories so we can heal, especially when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hear every day the trauma associated with some of our lived experiences, and storytelling is a way that we can share these things that happen to us, and we can be supported in healing as a result of sharing and telling our stories. So I love this quote. It's one of my favorite among many storytelling quotes that we use to help people think about stories. The story that lets us laugh and cry begins our healing. Now, a really good story is full of emotions and feelings. You'll recognize these characters, I'm sure, if you've seen the Disney movie Inside Out. These are some of our very basic emotions and feelings, right? But storytelling actually creates emotional and social intelligence. So the more we tell our stories and the more we keep it real about the emotions and feelings that we have in our stories, the better, right? So we want to always sit with whatever emotions and feelings are coming up in the stories. We don't want to suppress those. A lot of times, again, we want to be thinking about, oh, this one is good, that one's not so good. Let me stick with the good, and that will make for a very boring story. So what we encourage people to do is keep it real. Sit with the story, sit with the emotions, and figure out what those emotional indicators are telling us. There's the presenting emotion, and then there's the underlying emotions that are there in a very rich story. And we encourage people to actually write that out and process those emotions through writing them out and then being able to metabolize them and give them back in the story. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about diversity stories because diversity stories require, I think, a double dose of courage. These are often stories that we share around our experiences where we are excluded, experiences where we are misunderstood, experiences about our lives that are messy, and often the things that we wouldn't want to share with other people. But they're real. They're real stories. They're real stories of domestic violence. They're real stories of interracial marriage. They're real stories of being misunderstood, of being on the receiving end of microaggressions, micro inequities. These are all fodder for our diversity stories, and these are things that happen to us every single day. But when we can find the courage to tell these stories, they liberate us. So we really want a culture where people can show up, bring their whole selves, and choose to be authentic at work. And these diversity stories allow us to do that. They require a great deal of courage to share, lots of vulnerability, probably a double dose of vulnerability, and taking that risk to be emotionally exposed. But what we see in terms of the benefits of connection and having a real sense of belonging, because we're willing to bring our authenticity and to choose authenticity, then these stories have been used in lots of different ways that allow connection, greater understanding, building of cultural competence, and so on. Because oftentimes, with our diversity stories, there's some emotional labor. Sometimes that labor is the weight of disguise, right? And we're so accustomed to disguising ourselves, to trying to fit in, to blend in. But if we're going to thrive on diversity like we want to thrive on diversity, then we have to embrace our differences. And we have to learn to leverage those differences so that we have better, stronger outcomes and better, improved decisions at the end of the day. So some considerations when you tell your story, right? That's always a big question. And we encourage stories to be told after you've had some time to process the story. If it's still too emotional for you, then it's probably not the best time to tell the story, because you want to be able to get through the story. And the audience can sometimes be distracted if it feels like they need to take care of you as the teller. So when you tell your story, it should be something that you have processed sufficiently. It should be something that you have determined will give the impact that you want it to give. We tell our stories with intention. We tell our stories with purpose. We are trying to create change. And often in these diversity stories, it is social change that we're trying to create. So when you tell your story is important. The story you tell is important. And we always ask the question, what is a story you need to tell? There are stories we like to tell. As I mentioned before, those are the stories where we are probably the heroes in those stories, and look good in those stories. And we're always trying to look good and avoid looking bad. But the truth of the matter is that most of the time in our stories, there has to be some mess, some real drama, and some real learning that occurs. So we ask the question, what's a story you need to tell? Because that story that you need to tell will free you from the grips of sometimes shame, the humiliation, or embarrassment we experience as a result of those stories. They can help you see yourself better. Like oftentimes we can't really see ourselves fully until we unpack and process our stories. And when you tell your story, you free yourself and you free the people around you. You give permission. It's the allowing that I mentioned earlier, to not only acknowledge what happened, but in some cases to write the new ending to the story that you would like to see. We generate insights from stories. Self-reflection is a very positive thing. It is what allows us to grow in terms of emotional and social intelligence. Also receiving feedback from our stories. I'm told by lots of experts that and storytellers who tell all over the world and internationally and nationally that the best way to hone your stories is to keep telling them. Tell and retell the story and get feedback. Get feedback from your story. Did this piece of it land for you? What are you getting from the story? What are you getting from the story? Because 5 of us can hear the same story, and 5 of us might have 5 different perspectives or takeaways from that story. So as you tell your story, oftentimes it's good to build in time for feedback, to hear from others about what they're getting and learning from the story. And the last point that I'll make before I start to take some questions is the importance of the impact, right? The importance of the impact. Our stories teach us things that we need to learn about ourselves, things that we need to learn about our circumstances, things that we need to learn about others. Dr. Brene Brown wrote the book about Rising Strong, which is all about building resilience, and our stories help us build resilience. And so it's really, really important for us to be willing to develop the courage to tell our stories, right? Because the hardest thing, I think one of the hardest things about telling the story is the exposure, right? But it's what brings the relief, it's what brings the learning, and allows us to grow from the experiences that we have, to manage, to navigate some of the emotions that we have, especially shame. When we tell our stories, we release ourselves from the shame, humiliation, embarrassment that might be existing in those stories, and allows us to actualize to the people that we want to be. And when we become the people that we want to be collectively, we create organizations where this is the norm. We create a normal that accepts our common humanity and accepts the fact that we are imperfect and we are all made of strength and struggle. And with that, I will say that it's to dive in, right? To take the leap. Because stories are powerful motivators for all of us, and we all have stories to tell. And with that, Lindsay, yep.
Thank you so much, Pearl. So we have a few questions here. Can you talk a bit more about how organizations can build trust so that authenticity, vulnerability, and courage can exist?
Sure. So at Georgia Tech, we have one of our initiatives is our Inclusive Leaders Academy. And we also have a women's leadership development program. And in both of these, storytelling is one of the competencies that people have to build. And so that's how we work on building authenticity, vulnerability, courage, and trust, right? We actually require them as competencies, especially for leaders.
That's great. Thank you. How do you handle an audience that doesn't care or want to hear your story? Instead, they use your vulnerability and honesty as a weapon against you.
So Dr. Brene Brown says that we have to be careful about telling our stories to people that haven't earned the right to hear our stories. And so We do have to know our audiences when we're going to present and tell a story, and we do have to be selective. And even in those instances, I've had situations where there's always one. There's always one. And you just have to have the courage and to know that, that's a part of being vulnerable, right? The risks that you take in being vulnerable and the rewards that are associated with that are often much greater than that one or in some instances, several people who might not appreciate a story. But the best way to avoid that is to really be selective know as much about your audience and be selective about the story you choose to tell.
How can an organization encourage storytelling in their diversity initiatives?
Just dive in. Just dive in. Make the leaders go first, right? We did that. So we've had folks at very senior levels, vice presidents, deans, people like that who were willing to step forward and tell their stories. It took a lot of courage and risk taking, but we also worked with them. So one of the things that helps those leaders is story coaching. And so having some experts or people who are willing to put the time in to do the story coaching with the folks who are willing to tell their stories works really well.
Well, thank you so much, Pearl. Really great session. And I'm sure there are many other questions that'll be rolling in, but we really appreciate your time today. Our next Scheller Lunchtime Live is Friday, February 3rd at 12 p.m. Eastern, featuring Michael Buchanan, Senior Lecturer of Marketing at Scheller. Michael will discuss digital technologies and marketing. You can register for this event and learn more about future Scheller Lunchtime Live sessions by following the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business on LinkedIn. A recording of this session and future sessions will be available on our LinkedIn and YouTube pages as well. Thank you all for joining.